thank you everyone for joining us. Certainly thank you to Rob, Simon, and Matt for taking the time to do this presentation for us on a Friday before the long weekend. It's really appreciated. The idea here is to provide a little more context to the decision that was made to advertise or place price history on listings, active listings within Realtor.ca. An initiative that KADREA presented a couple of years ago and was adopted by several other boards, and as everybody knows, became active within the Kootenay Association of Realtors and the Kamloops and District Real Estate Association on April 15th. I'm going to do a quick introduction of our three guests, and then they'll do some presentations. We'll have a little bit of open discussion, finish off with some Q&A, and Joelle, I'll let you jump in here in a second. Just be ready to provide logistics around what that question and answer is going to look like, and then we'll hopefully wrap up within the hour. So first, introducing Rob Reiner, Industry Development Manager, now with KADREA, is really facilitating conversation between the folks at KADREA at executive level and down into frontline staff, and us at the boards, at the pushing 90 boards across Canada. Has really been able to facilitate some different conversations and some open dialogue, and truly appreciate it. So thank you, Rob, and thanks for joining us. Simon Parham is legal counsel with KADREA. His focus is the Realtor.ca aspect, and certainly the price history piece. Happy to have you here, Simon, to provide kind of that legal context and what the decisions were around that. Matthew Hansberger, joining us from Halifax, Dartmouth, Nova Scotia area, and is the president of Royal LePage Atlantic. Matthew is bringing a different perspective, completely industry perspective, kind of on the ground, what happened. Nova Scotia was the first to adopt price history on Realtor.ca in early 2019. So we're excited to hear Matthew's perspective on kind of the implications of that, what they've been seeing from both consumer and realtors, and kind of how they've addressed all of that impact. So thank you for taking the time, Matt. And welcome. Joelle, I'll let you jump in with kind of what people need to know to provide questions in the chat as we move, and then I'll throw it out to Rob to take the lead.
Sounds great. Thanks, Trevor. So what we've done is we've switched the chat on for you to be able to ask your questions of the panelists. So if you have any questions you'd like us to address, please add them in the chat. And then what we'll do is we'll speak to, I'll repeat those questions to those folks that we have on the panel, and then they'll be able to answer them for you. So please feel free to add those in there.
Great, thanks, Joelle. Rob, I'll pass it off to you.
All right, very good. I appreciate that very much. I'm just going to do, well, I think you just have to enable some screen sharing for me, Joelle, and then I can get my slide deck up.
Absolutely. Give me one moment here. Okay, you should be good to go there.
There we go. Okay, you guys can see that okay?
We can.
Okay, just let me adjust a couple of windows here. Okay, all right, everybody. Thank you very much, and good morning for some of you, and good afternoon for Matthew and some others watching down east as well. So it's a real pleasure to be here. You know, as you know, it's always better to meet in person. That's the best way, but I am really grateful that we're living in these times, these amazing times. We can meet virtually, we can share some information, we can share some ideas despite this global pandemic. And today, we're really going to set the stage and the context around sold prices on Realtor.ca. As Trevor mentioned, this is information that's been on the site in your region since the middle of April, April 15. So today, we're going to cover a lot of ground. We're going to talk to you about Realtor.ca and the path forward for the website. We're obviously going to cover off the display of sold data on Realtor.ca, why it's important, why it's there. We're going to bring you some perspective from those who've been down the path before. Again, that's where Matthew's going to jump in, give us perspective of nearly a decade of sold data being very public in his market through a popular virtual office website and now on Realtor.ca. This will be a fire hose today. We're going to go through this relatively quickly, but this is being recorded, so you'll be able to go back and pick up on anything that we missed. But we are going to walk through some data points more rapidly than we would just based on the time constraints and the medium, of course. So as you know, things are changing. We've experienced this, and it's rapid. It's being driven by leveraging technology and instant access to data. Now, this lens on technology is really super focused due to the events obviously related to COVID-19. But in fact, the businesses that had previously embraced technology and collaborative platforms, they're for the most part still functioning and doing very well. Restaurants are a great example of that. Many made pivots, important adjustments. They're keeping things going right now. In fact, many are actually more successful despite the pandemic. But there has been effect. The transformation of your business practice is not really an option at this point. But having said all of this, with COVID being a major focus right now, this didn't sneak up on us. This is not 100% directly related to the COVID pandemic. This transition has been happening for many, many years. What's happened right now is the focus. It's been exposed by COVID. If you think back to 2009, we lived by pretty simple rules. Don't get in cars with strangers and don't connect with people or meet people over the internet. Well, if you fast forward to today, we know things have changed. Think of the Uber experience. You literally summon a stranger from the internet, get into their car, and they take you somewhere and you pay them for it. Sometimes waiting 5 minutes seems too long. And if you told someone 15 years ago they'd be married with 2 kids to someone they met on a website called eHarmony, you would have taken that bet and you would have probably taken a lot of money from them. But obviously we've evolved, and technology and data has really driven that. If you think of Silicon Valley and Wall Street, and venture capitalists, they are really paying attention to this shift and have been for a while, and they see extreme opportunity in our industry. Investors are putting their money into this industry like never before. Now, the buzzword that's been coined for this is prop tech, so investment in property technology. This trend is not slowing down. 2019 was a record year for investment in prop tech, $27 billion. Some estimates put that over $30 billion. It's going to be interesting to see some of the effects and even long tail effects of the COVID on this investment. Is the capital still there? But safe to say that the investment community is extremely interested in what we do. We have heard this before. This question has been asked countless times over the years. It was the end of the catalog and the green sheets, prices on print ads, interior photos of listings, now virtual showings and online transactions. So the question is again, is this the end for the realtor? And the unequivocal answer is no, it's not. While the context and the role of the realtor has changed yet again, we've seen this before. It does not change the need for the realtor. Consumers see the value in working with a professional through the process. They are getting information from many, many different sources, about 11 on average, before they contact you. But that doesn't mean it's getting easier. Realtors are not the gatekeepers of the data anymore. Self-research is king. We've seen this in many other industries as well. They do not need to meet you at the office and have you show them what's for sale. But the paperwork, the negotiations, market analysis, industry knowledge, and price verification, that's what you bring to the table. Your clients need you now more than ever, despite all of the data that's available to them. They need a trusted advisor to help analyze the data and advise them. The need for the realtor has never been stronger, and the numbers cited here are up from 66% in the previous survey, and the 2020 survey is on the street now. Agent-assisted sales at an all-time high, according to the National Association of Realtors profile of home buyers and sellers. It's up from 85% in 2014 and 81% in 2001. So why am I showing you a picture of Tiger Woods and his former caddy, Steve Williams? The reason I'm showing you this picture is to use this analogy to try and set this in your mind. Many realtors, the vast majority of realtors, think of themselves as Tiger Woods, that you're at the center of all of this and that your clients are looking at you to be the superstar. But in fact, your clients are Tiger Woods. You're the caddy, you're Steve Williams in this equation. They have been just inundated with data points over the last 10 years, more and more and more data, and they want it, but they need someone to help analyze it. They need you to tell them what club to hit in what scenario to succeed. And that's why you're the caddy in this equation. Analyze that data for them and help them make great decisions with their homes. The majority of consumers indicate they want to use one of you the next time they transact real estate. Those numbers are very clear. There is, however, still a large undecided in this equation, and that's where a powerful Realtor.ca comes into play into the Canadian marketplace. 92% of Canadians are aware of Realtor.ca, according to the latest Nanos research. That is a huge number. If you look at the market share of the website, it is clear. Realtor.ca is the top red line. Every other real estate website is below. So there is no comparison that Realtor.ca has massive market share across the country. It's your site, it's your brand. And when consumers start their search, they may not be connected with one of you yet. But every time a consumer visits Realtor.ca, we use that as an opportunity. What we built here in Canada is very unique. This partnership of the boards, the multiple listing service systems, realtors, and Realtor.ca is something very, very special, and it's highly valued. 8.8 million realtor profile views on the site last year. That's up 47% from 2019. On average, realtor profiles are viewed about 1,000 times per hour on the site. That's really become a digital business card for you. 291 million visits to the site last year. That's up 12% over 18. About 5 billion page views, 37 million hours on Realtor.ca is what the consumer has spent. That's 2 millenniums looking for real estate. They love real estate and they love what you do, and they're coming to the site. 43% of those visitors go directly to the site, and that's very important. They're typing that URL directly into their browser and going there. There's definitely been a COVID effect, however, on the site. So around the 10th of March, we did see a decrease in overall visitors and sessions to the site. That's when government policy started to affect the movement of people during this pandemic. So March 10 to yesterday, about 5.5% down year over year, which really is an incredible number when you consider the impact that COVID's had on the real estate market. Just a few weeks ago, when I would do this presentation, that number was well into the double digits. So the site has recovered beautifully despite the pandemic. This graph starts January 1 of this year and moves to yesterday, and you can see right around early March that drop. It was a dramatic drop in traffic and leads on the site, but it has recovered over the course of this pandemic. And we've now, as of around the 3rd of May, gone past last year's numbers and are really picking up right where we left off. Overall sessions for the year are up 6.1%. Now that's despite the pandemic. So those are incredible numbers. So what's the path forward? What does all this mean to the future of the site? Well, there's really 3 focuses for Realtor.ca. Number 1 is we want to grow market share of the site. We want to delight users with a friction-free search experience for property. And then ultimately, we want to generate high quality leads for you. That's the ultimate goal. So let's start with growing market share. As I said, 43% of those visitors go directly to the site, but that means the majority actually find their way there other ways. More than half get through referring sources one way or another. That includes some referrals from other real estate sources. And so that's where partnerships have been very powerful for the site. 11 different sources, as I indicated, according to Google, that a consumer is going to search before they make a decision. It's important for Realtor.ca to have a strong brand awareness on other platforms where the consumer goes. We've developed important partnerships through the DDF to display listings on other platforms. They're all powered by Realtor.ca, the most trusted source for MLS system data. The Toronto Dominion site would be a great example of that. They've been a DDF partner for about 2 years now. Also Scotiabank, and then most recently the Globe and Mail. Now these partner sites, along with a host of real estate advertising websites, help Realtor.ca remain top of mind with the consumer, creates another source of a lead for you, because all of the leads that come off these partner sites go directly to the listing agent. They're not funneled through the partner sites to hand out to you. You can keep track of all of this through member.realtor.ca. Brokers, you can enable sharing of your brokerage listings to DDF partners from your DDF control center. You just have to log in to member.realtor.ca. We're also finding new and unique ways of creating consumer touch points by dipping into some new voice technology, which is really, it's in the infancy right now, but voice is scaling exponentially with the consumer, so we want to be in that space as well. So the second was delighting users with a friction-free search experience. Well, the user experience, or UX as we call it, is extremely important. And at the core of that is quality data. And that data is a combination of the data that's generated by you through the multiple listing service, as well as through our partnerships. So what do you think the most requested source or piece of data is on listings on Realtor.ca? Well, it's one of the reasons we're here: historical sold price. The consumer has told us over and over again, and so have members, that they want this data point to be part of their home buying or selling investigation. The reason for that is a great search creates context for the consumer. That's why we added school information, walk score, neighborhood demographics, and different calculators. It's all designed to keep the consumer on the site and help them during the stages of their real estate journey. Home affordability is the next one up. We're launching this pilot in 3 markets in June. It gives consumers insight to what it actually means to live in a particular property. It's the total living cost, because as a realtor, you know the consumer does not live in the price of the home. They live in the ultimate payment, and this is going to help them figure that out. Agent ratings have been on the site for a while now. They were launched a few years ago, piloted in Saskatchewan, and then rolled out nationally. And all of this leads to generating high quality leads for you. You need to leverage best-in-class tech to give the consumers a look at properties before they go physically. And this has never been more valuable than it has been during this time of the pandemic. We're very glad we're not playing catch up on using this type of technology, and that we were leading edge on this type of listing display. Over about 10 virtual tour providers are now supported by the site. And to display this type of content, you just need to drop that video tour URL into the video tour field in the back end of your multiple listing service system portal. We also launched live stream open house during the pandemic. This has been very popular with the consumer and with members. Live streaming supports all of the live streaming services. Visitors can join live. They can add things to their calendar. You can schedule events ahead of time. It's got DDF support and data load support. So you can go right into your Realty server. We're almost 8,000 total live streams added since going live, and over 80 boards are just submitting this data directly to the site through their MLS system. So live stream was a great adaptation for the pandemic that will live well past it. And of course, the site is still generating leads for you. 774,000 leads approximately, year to date. That's up 9.7%. That's despite the pandemic. So that's about 5,700 leads a day coming off of Realtor.ca to realtors. That's a big number. And you can track all of this again at member.realtor.ca. You can see your listing stats. And I encourage you to download the new listing stats app that has been released and is updated frequently. This gives you mobile access to all of the metrics on your listings, and you can communicate and connect with your leads and your clients. Go to your app store, and it's the black icon with the Realtor logo, not the red one. The red one is the consumer brand. The black one is for you. You can go to the App Store and download that today. I also want to take a moment to tell you to check out the Insights report. This gives you insight into the mind of the consumer and what they're doing on the site. So go to insights.realtor.ca and you can get local insights in your market. It'll tell you what the consumer is searching for on the site. This can be very important as you go through your business cycle as well. Okay, so local insights through insights.realtor.ca. So how does sold data fit into all of this? I mean, that's a lot of information and a lot of vision stuff, some practical tools that have been added. So how does sold data fit into this vision? Well, we get to jump into our time machine, and usually for Canadians, that's the United States. If you look at the United States, it's been more than a decade since this type of data has been publicly accessible on the web. In 2018, about 90% of all US buyers and sellers used an agent. That was up from 85% in 14. And typically, a for sale by owner home sells way less than an agent assisted home. So despite all of this data being available in this marketplace, we've had this basically lab to look at and watch for the last decade and say, you know, it has not negatively impacted the realtor. In fact, it's enhanced what they do every day. A great example is Zillow out of the United States. Same on Realtor.com in the United States, other successful sites. They've been providing this data for a while. This has really become the expectation for Canadian consumers as well as they experience this when they go south of the border. It's what we call, or it's a buzzword called table stakes. It's just meaning a minimum set of requirements to be relevant. It just needs to be there. And you'll notice here that in some cases, they put pending sales data up south of the border. That's not something we're doing here. We believe that should be behind a virtual office website through the login. And this is something that was based on an interpretation from the Competition Bureau as well. And it's more than just sold data. It's leveraging all sorts of data points. Big data becomes part of a larger data strategy when predicting where listings are even coming next and where home values are going. That's the next iteration of this, is predictive analytics. Companies south of the border are spending millions of dollars a year on artificial intelligence models, and they're looking at real estate and consumer data, mashing them together to create a larger search experience and a predictive search experience. So this is kind of the next burgeoning field, and sold data plays into that as well. On a very micro scale, similar listing feature does this on the site. On Realtor.ca, similar listings are displayed for the consumer based on their search criteria, and these have an incredible lead conversion rate. The consumer really likes this experience, similar to what you'd see in an Amazon scenario. So what about the Canadian landscape? Well, New Brunswick, land registry, no login required. You can simply search this information if you're a consumer. Ontario, same thing, sold data available online through Service Ontario, a simple internet search. In Saskatchewan, it is behind a paywall in Saskatchewan, but it's a very low barrier. The interesting thing about Saskatchewan is it's a terrible search experience. So by providing this on Realtor.ca, it would give the consumer easier access to data they want, and it would be from a much more credible site that the consumer already goes to look at real estate data. And in BC, as you know, many of you know, a simple first name, last name, email, and you can have a full map search with many properties already indicated on the site with sold data behind them. You can even do a quick internet search and get this data through BC assessment. So the data is out there in the ecosystem. And again, the idea is to drive it to a site that the consumer is already comfortable being on. And when you think about the initial implementation of sold prices on Realtor.ca, it's a very low-key approach to the display of this data compared to the other sites. Again, we think back many years ago to the infancy of the internet age, when we were having the same debate about multiple photos on a listing, showing the property address on the internet, putting the list price in a print ad, adding the location of the property on a map. All of these at one point were going to displace you from the transaction, and that clearly has not happened. And so at this point, I want to just throw it over to Simon Parham from our KADREA legal team to delve into this sold data on Realtor.ca a little deeper from a legal standpoint. And just Simon is KADREA's Chief Privacy Officer as well. So Simon, I'll throw it over to you.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, so I'm just going to go into some of the legal aspects, as Rob just mentioned, on displaying sold price information on Realtor.ca, and I'll start with a little bit of history. Really, back in 2018, KADREA was approached by a number of boards to display this information on Realtor.ca, and KADREA's board of directors passed a motion allowing that information to be displayed on Realtor.ca on request of a local board. So that's a key point. Next slide, please. It's already been mentioned what the current status is, but since 2018, just to reiterate, KADREA has moved forward with a number of boards, including the Kootenay and Kamloops boards, to display this historical sold price information on Realtor.ca. And I think it was mentioned earlier that as of April 15th, your board's historical sold price information is being shown. And the way it works is that if a house was, say, sold in 2010 and 2001, then those historical sold price information would be displayed in association with an active listing on Realtor.ca. So if at some point a listing becomes no longer active and is removed from Realtor.ca, then the historical sold price information would also no longer be displayed. So that's what is currently going on right now. A couple points to mention on the slide here. To be clear, this information is only being displayed on Realtor.ca. It's not being provided to third parties, so it's not included in any DDF feeds. And as I earlier mentioned, it's only on request of a local board. So we're really trying to move forward in a partnership here. So in looking at the legal analysis, we considered a couple of things. First, we looked at the local regulation in each province. We didn't want to put you guys offside of the law. So we reached out following 2018 to the local regulators in each province and got varying responses. But the one that you're likely most interested in is what did the BC regulator say? Just next slide, please. And the good news was they started off their response with clear support for this initiative, which is obviously great to see. But more importantly, from a legal perspective, they confirmed that there was no regulatory hurdle to displaying sold price information on Realtor.ca. They did cite one of your real estate rules, which requires that consent be obtained from a client to display any advertising. But you already have that consent through your MLS system listing agreements. So that's no obstacle. So basically, there was no regulatory hurdle in British Columbia. We also looked at this from a privacy point of view. And why that matters is because sold price information is a type of information which is known as personal information. That's one of those terms of art that us lawyers like to throw out there to confuse everyone. But really what it comes down to is this is information about someone or could be related about someone. So we got to treat it a little bit carefully. And Canada has legislation, it's known as PIPEDA, which applies generally, except in provinces like BC, where a provincial privacy law applies. So we took a look at BC's privacy legislation and said, is there an issue here? We even reached out to outside counsel on this one. And we came to the conclusion, no, we don't see any, we see this as a very low risk issue. As long as consent is obtained from clients to display their sold price information on Realtor.ca, we don't see an issue. So we actually worked with your association, provided some language to make sure that consent was there, and that was done. And in my view, in our view, all the sufficient protections are in place to have this information on Realtor.ca from a privacy point of view. So I know you might have been expecting a real detailed legal analysis of multiple factors, but really it's that simple. There are no provincial regulator concerned in the province of British Columbia with displaying this information on Realtor.ca. And the low privacy risk that we initially analyzed could be mitigated by simply getting consent from the client in order to display this information. And we actually took some additional steps, including we looked at, as was explained earlier, the fact that it was already being displayed in other contexts on Realtor.ca, and responding quickly. If we ever get a complaint, we take that information down. So all that together basically means we don't really see an issue with displaying this information from a legal perspective on Realtor.ca. That's it for me.
All right. Thanks very much, Simon. I appreciate that insight very much. So next, I think it's always beneficial to get a perspective from someone who's actually lived through this, a situation that you're about to go through. So that's why we're going to hand it over to Matthew now. Matthew is the president and co-owner of Royal LePage Atlantic. It's a 400 agent brokerage in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. He's been in the real estate industry since 2004. He's been a salesperson, a managing broker, a broker of record, and now owner of a brokerage. Matt is the current past president of the Nova Scotia Association of Realtors. He's the current chair of the Technology Committee and the Bylaw Committee for the Provincial Association there. And he's also the past chair of the KADREA Technology Committee. So Matt, from your perspective, could you just give some insight into the, after this data started to become very public many years ago, what the initial reaction was, and then what the long tail of that has been?
Absolutely, happy to do that. And I'll give a little context as to how long we've been kind of facing this and in what degree. So I'm based out of Nova Scotia. I live in Halifax, and Nova Scotia in about 2011, we provided a VOW feed for a brokerage that was a startup here in Nova Scotia. This VOW is run by a gentleman who I've become pretty good friends with. We share a barber, although not right now, and we talk about this kind of stuff all the time. So this VOW feed was granted, I would argue, without our board at the time really having a lot of ideas as to what a VOW feed could potentially do to impact our marketplace. And this guy he's a tech entrepreneur. So he'd started a company that his previous company was one that was essentially a check clearing company, and had basically automated a lot of that. And his goal at that point was to bring a total transparency to the real estate market in Nova Scotia at the time, with the thoughts of probably growing that across the country. So we issued a VOW feed, and there were very few rules initially about how he could display sold prices. So basically, within about 6 months of us, maybe 8 months of us issuing this VOW feed as a board, with an email address and a username, you could see the sales history of every property in the province of Nova Scotia. So not just the ones that were actively listed, but every property. He had layered the property. We call it property online. It's the Registry of Deeds. Provided him a shapefile for every property in the province, and he had layered the sales data over top of assessment data, school zone catchments, all that kind of stuff. It's a brilliant website, and very quickly became what I would describe as the go-to place for people to find homes in Nova Scotia. So it's a competitor of Realtor.ca, I would say, in Nova Scotia when it comes to eyeballs for the viewership of the public when it comes to sale prices. He runs a brokerage. That's how he got this access. His intention, and I could say this from knowing him personally, was never to really run a brokerage. His intention was to build a platform that had that transparency that he knew the public was hungry for at that point. And so for 9 years, we as agents have been dealing with, basically all of our consumers knowing the entire sales history of every property in the province here. And so that's what we initially were faced with. At the beginning, I'll tell you what I knew were the fears of all of the agents in our offices anyway. The first fear that people had was that this would completely disintermediate the agent out of the transaction, that agents would basically no longer be needed. And essentially what I would describe that as is a theory where agents thought the pie was going to be getting smaller. In so much as there would be just less volume that agents were dealing with. And very quickly it became apparent that the number of transactions that happen through agents was not going to be negatively affected. In fact, what I've seen over the course of the last 9 years is that the transparency around sales prices has gotten more Nova Scotians interested in real estate, and probably the pie has grown. If I were to talk to the owner of this brokerage now, his stated belief was that the pie was going to essentially double. It has not done that. Market conditions, the economic conditions broadly, mortgage rules, things like that have affected the number of transactions happening in the province much more than certainly the transparency of the market. But I would say that the net effect is that the pie has not gotten smaller. Agents are still doing as many transactions still go through our MLS system as ever have, with the public having virtually very easy access to the entire sales history data in Nova Scotia. The second fear that certainly the folks in my brokerage dealt with was the fear that this brokerage was now going to be the dominant player. And so this is a little less relevant to the sold prices on Realtor.ca argument, but we also found that wasn't the case, that agents were not just the gatekeepers of this information. People were not just coming to my agents to get access to sold price data. They were coming to my agents because of the advice that those agents have been giving them over the years, and the relationship that they had built with those folks. Sold price data was a very small part of what agents were providing prior to this brokerage coming along and making it publicly available, essentially publicly available. And in fact, our market share has grown, over the course of the last 9 years. Now, I will say that brokerage has picked up market share as it's grown as well. He's a good operator also. And, so I think that that's just a product of a new business model coming into a marketplace. And yet, it has not displaced the success of all of our agents in my brokerage. The third fear, and this was one that I think was probably, it came along after the initial big fears of there's not going to be any business for us, or he's going to take all of our business away from us, was that generally the consumer, with having more knowledge, would put more pressure on commissions for us, that they wouldn't value the act of doing a CMA as highly, they wouldn't value our advice as much. And I could tell you that over the course of 10 years, I've been through two, I would describe it as cycles, going from a seller's market through a buyer's market for about 3 or 4 years, and then we're back into a low inventory kind of seller's market right now. And the market conditions above anything have affected the pressure that we would see on commissions on a transaction by transaction basis. Certainly not transparency with respect to sales prices there. So that was a fear that proved to be kind of unfounded as well. There was a little bit of a fear that once sellers knew what the prices were on properties, that they would be able to, they'd be more resistant to us giving them advice around what their home should be put on the market for. And so that was something that we've kind of overcome as well. And it kind of all comes down to the question of, do you really value a more informed consumer or not? And I'll kind of share a little bit of my, I guess, prior to real estate work history, because I think it informs this discussion a little bit. So I was an equities trader before I got into real estate. I lived in Toronto and traded NASDAQ and a little bit of commodities. And one of the things that's beautiful about the equities markets is that the information is all out there for everybody. If you're a publicly traded company, the disclosure requirements are massive. You have to talk about what your operational plans are. You have to talk about what your earnings were. You have to talk about your financial stability, all of those kinds of things. And so anyone can make an informed decision about whether they want to buy Microsoft today or not. What the realtor learned, kind of like what the equities advisors learned when E-Trade and those kinds of companies were coming along and making access to markets a lot easier, is that people out there are paying for the advice. They're paying for you to take all of that information and parse it, or take all of that information and interpret it for them. They're not paying for access to it. They do believe that access to that information is a right that is bestowed upon them by being in the world. And so, I think it's Realtor.ca's time to start to be the provider of that information. Full disclosure, I was on the Technology Council over the last couple of years, and we've discussed this an awful lot. I am fairly strongly in favor of Realtor.ca providing sales prices. I actually would argue that sales prices history should be a little bit broader than what it is, but it's only because I've seen actually our pie grow in size over the course of the last 9 years. There is more interest in the industry. There's more interest in when people are browsing, looking at what homes have sold for. It leads to them having conversations with their significant other about, hey, listen, maybe we should think about upsizing. Maybe we should think about doing something different with what we have. It sparks a greater conversation level about real estate, and I believe that actually has created a larger pie for us all, and certainly has not disintermediated the realtor at that point. We've seen that the informed consumer can make decisions quicker. The informed consumer comes to us looking for advice with perhaps less homes that they want to go see. So they will have already narrowed down slightly what it is that they want to see. They'll determine, because they've been able to do comparison shopping, what good value is and what good value isn't in their mind. And then they'll just want a realtor to either validate that or to add some more context to those decisions that they've already made. So you get a consumer that's more ready to make a purchase decision. And you have an agent who, you have a seller as well, who, I think is having a more informed discussion with you when it comes to the price of their home. It hasn't changed that, Mr. and Mrs. Jones think their house is worth more than their neighbor's house because of the way the sun shines on their back deck. That has not changed at all. People will always have a bias towards their own home, but it's very difficult for them to argue with data that they can now see, and there's no perception that you're only providing the data that supports your argument, because they have access to everything, and realtors have been forced to sort of up their game that way with respect to their awareness about the entirety of the market and the entirety of what's sold in the neighborhood before they go provide advice. So it was fear that drove things early on in our province. I think that fear has largely subsided now. There are still the odd outliers in our AGM who will complain about the transparency of sales data, but for the most part, I would argue that most realtors in our area have either gotten to a point of acceptance, or some of them are even happy that we've gone down the path of being more transparent with sales prices because of the net effect on our markets. So that's kind of my experience with it. I don't know if you're looking for more than that, Rob, and certainly happy to answer any questions that you guys might have. So.
No, that was amazingly well delivered, and an amazing perspective from your marketplace. So, Trevor, I'll just turn it back to you. We do have some time for questions, so I'll throw it back to you.
Yeah, no, that's great. First of all, I'll say to everyone out there still with us, feel free to throw some questions into the chat if there's areas specific to your experiences that you want to bounce off of the panelists here, and kind of get some answers to your questions. So feel free to do that. Gentlemen, I honestly pictured me having to facilitate a little bit of a discussion here, but you really hit all of the points. It was a great presentation, well delivered, and covered off all the things that that we had kind of discussed in advance. Matt, I'm going to put you on the spot here a little bit, potentially, one thing that I think is still out there, potentially with our members, is like, even with all the explanation of how important it is for the industry to have price history out there and to be competitive and to be you know, transparent to the consumer, and what all those advantages are. I think that what some of the challenges for our members is explaining to the consumer when they come to them why price history is on there. Why is the price history of my home being publicly shared on Realtor.ca? And I don't know, the reason I think I'm putting you on the spot is because your consumers in Nova Scotia had already been privy to this. They've already seen that experience with the other platform that's out there, and so they might not have been as adverse to it. But what we're definitely seeing in a very small number of cases, is that the consumer is seeing their price history on there and saying to the realtor, well, why is this? Mm-hmm. So do you feel that that message is different when your realtors are explaining to the consumer versus why it's good for the industry?
Yeah, so it is, there's a different argument for sure with the consumer. And we, about 3 years after this virtual office came along, as a province, had full transparency from a provincial site as well. So we have the Provincial Valuation Services Corporation site that basically displays the sale prices of every property in Nova Scotia as well. That came along after this virtual office. So I'll think back to the time when we did not have the excuse of the province is publishing it anyway. Sounds to me like you and BC have, you know, the opportunity to just say, hey, listen, you know, this information's readily available for anyone who wants to go find it anyway. But prior to that, the discussion we had was with the consumer who is selling their home. What's the first thing you're looking for when you go buy a home? You're looking to figure out what the value of this property is when you're shopping on Realtor.ca. You're looking for that level of transparency. So we're providing it. You know, it's now been made more readily available to people. We had all the same questions that you did. I have a high net worth client who doesn't want the sale price of their property to be displayed. I have a consumer who's really concerned because they're getting divorced and they don't want their ex to know what they sold the home for, those kinds of things. And in a lot of ways, we just had to kind of calm them as to the fear of this is something that everyone is out there trying to talk to their neighbor about, et cetera, et cetera. It never got to that point, but that fear was really real. Again, it's not. It sounds like it's an industry answer, but the industry answer is based upon what the consumer's desire is. So, you know, I will tell you, if we could go back, if we could roll the clock back and have Realtor.ca be leading the charge on this in our area, we'd be super happy about that. Because who was leading the charge on this was one of our competitors. There weren't a lot of rules in place that had been put up, and our competitor essentially decided to display it however they want and advertise it however they wanted as well. And I'll tell you that you all provide sales price history, whether you do it digitally or not. When you hand a listing cut to someone or you provide a sales price to someone through a CMA, you're doing what this competitor is doing. You're just doing it in an analog fashion. And so when our industry sort of initially reacted negatively, it became a discussion that was very relevant to the Competition Bureau in terms of, listen, this guy is having people sign in. They're agreeing to a minimum a customer status with his brokerage, and then he's providing them data that every other realtor is providing there. And he has every right to do so. And you cannot argue that he doesn't have the right to do so. So, you know, consumers are out there finding sales prices. They're doing it through you right now in an offline or analog fashion. Maybe you're emailing it, but sometimes you're just handing them a listing cut. So we made the argument to people that you know, that sales price information, even if it's not readily available on a website, is fairly readily available. If I call any realtor and ask them what, you know, Jill's house sold for down the street, I'm probably going to get that information pretty quickly. And so, you know, that was the argument that we were making to consumers, is that it is readily available. Yes, it's now digital. Yes, people can do it from their basement now without having to leave the home. But ultimately, you know, they can get that information anyways. And it became an argument that, you know, it didn't sort of win the day in every case, but, you know, for the most part, people who had any experience with the real estate industry knew how easy it was to find out what a property had sold for.
Yeah. And I think that Ty, yeah, you connected those dots really well. Is the consumer's initial reaction, though it's hard to convince a consumer of rationale based on a bigger picture for an entire industry, if in fact it's to accommodate the appetite of the buying consumer that is eventually going to navigate their way to that seller's listing and ask more questions and engage the realtor as a result, then obviously it's good to have that information out there. So it's a bigger conversation. You have to wrap your head around kind of putting it into the context that the seller will understand and will appreciate, but it all ties it together. And I appreciate that. I appreciate that response, Matt. I'm going to touch on a couple of things here that showed up in the chat to the panelists. Still some questions about, and after all of that explanation, the questions are still, how do we get our price history off of Realtor.ca for clients? And of course, that is possible. But what I want to make sure the message is, and the rationale for this webinar, for the questionnaire that was sent out earlier this week, or the Q&A, is that you totally appreciate that it should be at the request of the client and under circumstances that make sense for them to withhold or retain their privacy on that information if they want to. What we're trying to get away from is that everybody does this en masse, and it affects, it has a negative effect on what we're trying to achieve here with Realtor.ca and with the future of the information that we're putting out. So to answer the folks that were asking what that process looks like, if you go back in your email to an email, Joelle, you can help me out with this. It was sent out Monday or Tuesday. I'm going to say Tuesday. From the Kootenay Association of Realtors. There's actually the initial piece about this webinar, but also a long list of Q&A. It is on there, the last question, but please read the other 9 or 10 that are there as well. Gavin, I'll give you a chance if that didn't touch on the answer to your question, you can let us know. And then another comment from somebody here who inadvertently just volunteered for a task force we're creating and doesn't really realize it, around doing more with our own platform around disclosure and sharing of information and data, and trying to engage those consumers, keep those consumer eyeballs on our information. We are having all of those conversations internally, and certainly us as an association, our board, and myself are learning from this experience to engage the membership, engage our tech committee, and make sure that we have those conversations more broadly before we make any big moves that way. So question here, this might be for you, Rob. Has there been any issues with consistency of sold information? For example, a property may have sold twice over the last 10 years versus a house that is on the market for the first time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a good question. So not every active listing on Realtor.ca will have past sold price in the property history. So only if it's available through the data feed that's coming from the board or association. So in the example of the property that might have sold twice over the last 10 years, it likely would have that information in the property history price section, but the one that's new to the market had never run through the multiple listing service before in that region likely will not have that data. And so right now, well, I guess I say when we launched, and I'm assuming the numbers are very similar now, when we launched in Kamloops and Kootenay, it's about at 20% of the listings at any given time will have that information on them. So it's directly related to the data that's in the feed that comes from the board.
Yeah, and that's a great explanation, Rob. I'm going to take it one step further, and maybe Matt, I'll throw this piece over to you. I think what this gentleman's getting at is say a property sold over the last 10 years, but it sold the first time through the MLS system, and that sold data is available through price history on Realtor.ca, but it didn't sell through, it sold for sale by owner the second time. Has there been a challenge with realtors to navigate, kind of the explanation around the inconsistency with that sold data versus what's out there on potentially other platforms that are pulling from government sources?
Well, this is the point, right? Is that every home has some little twist like that that's important to understand, right? So if that were the case, then yes, that would be something that's going to need a human to help uncover, right? The last time a property sold, it might have been a 3-bedroom without the addition on the back as well. And these are the kinds of things that require the human intervention on this. This is too big a purchase for people to make without validating the data that they're finding online. That's what we've discovered. And so, there will be those gaps that exist there. Those gaps exist no matter what. It's really only the province that could compel every sale price to be reported there. And so, our province does that now, and you'll find times where the sold price on Realtor.ca will be different than the most recent sold price on our property valuation site. And that's because of what you just described. So again, a great realtor will take the time to figure out what has happened there and be ready to have a discussion with any potential buyers of that property, or be more prepared when they go meet with that seller around those kinds of things.
Yeah, no, great explanation. We are at 11:01 according to the phone on my desk and my other phone. I see, unless anybody else has anything, if you pop it in the chat in the next 10-15 seconds, we'll pause and acknowledge it. But otherwise, gentlemen, I really want to thank you for your time and certainly your insight into this. You can appreciate the value that you were able to provide to our members, where some of them are hearing this information for the first time, and kind of wrapping their heads around what this all looks like for their consumers, but as well as themselves and their business. So, Matt, your perspective was very much appreciated. Simon, thanks for making sure that we were on side with all of this. And Rob, certainly all of your efforts to continue these conversations. We'll be providing this webinar as a recording to the membership. We will certainly be open to further questions, and can pass those on to our panelists if we need to engage them to help answer any other questions that might come up. Unless there's anything else, gentlemen? All good.
Thank you very much. Thanks so much for having us today.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, guys. Enjoy your long weekend, and all the best. Stay safe.
All
Take
right.
care.
Take it easy.
Thank you.
See you later.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.